What we are up against is not just Israel versus Palestinians. It's an attempt to maintain the supremacy of a Western colonial order, which will always and has always represented the brown and black, colonized other as emotional, as unreasonable, as unrestrained, as bestial, as barbaric and uncivilised. And so it really does filter down, as you said, into who is considered a credible voice and who isn't.
Welcome to The Big Picture, a show about the past, the present, and the future. My name is Mohammed Hassan, and this is the first episode of our third season. We begin with a question. Is the media's coverage of Gaza tainted by a deeply held bias against Palestinians? That is what award-winning Australian writer and sociologist Dr Randa Abdel Fattah is arguing. She says Islamophobia and Orientalism are deeply entrenched in the way the media covers Arabs, Muslims, and the Middle East, and that Palestinian victims, in particular Palestinian men, are often portrayed as less deserving of sympathy and justice. She's not alone. This month, the UK's Centre for Media Monitoring, a project by the Muslim Council of Britain, published a lengthy study into media coverage of Gaza in the October 7 attacks. It found that pro-Palestinian voices were frequently vilified or treated with hostility by the media, and that emotive language was used to describe Israeli victims 11 times more frequently than Palestinians. That not only includes Palestinian children, but also prisoners and victims of sexual violence, whose stories have often been overlooked or diminished by major news outlets. So how do prominent Palestinian voices get their message across? Randa Abdel Fattah, it's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome to The Big Picture.
Thank you for having me.
So you are somebody that spends a lot of your time writing about Palestine and speaking about it, advocating on behalf of Palestinians in the media here in Australia. And it's been 5 months since October 7th, and your voice has been prominent throughout that time. I want to start by asking you how you're doing.
Every Palestinian answers this in the same way, I feel, which is it depends what time of day you're asking me.
Yeah.
Because our emotional state fluctuates between moments of rage, moments of despair, moments of energy and hope and resilience. But if I'm speaking and working, then you know I'm in a good place.
Yeah, the work is what is keeping you going.
Absolutely.
And at this point, I think in the first days and weeks since October 7th, there was a lot of attempts to try and kind of get a hold of the narrative. There was a lot of pushback in the media. There's a lot of pushback from pro-Israeli voices, from Israeli government voices as well, trying to frame what has happened and what is happening in Gaza. And we are 5 months down the line now, and there is so much that has happened on the ground in Gaza. There's so much that's happened to the Palestinian people there, and a lot of it we as an international community have been witness to. Where do you see the media landscape now? Where do you see the way that the world, the international community, views what is happening in Gaza?
Well, of course, when we talk about the media, we recognize it's very plural, complex, diverse. So focusing on establishment, corporate, legacy media, because that is our main challenge as Palestinians, having our narrative platformed, having to constantly have our views and political agenda or suppressed or managed, our voices managed, and seeing that the Zionist agenda, the Zionist political talking points are laundered through the media, given a platform, privileged and deferred to. This is our main challenge. I don't see that has changed. In fact, I feel that the suppression is getting worse. In the beginning, and I'll speak on behalf of myself here, there were more opportunities as there was this sense of panic and shock by a media machine that had very much ignored the Palestinian plight before October 7, but took notice when settlers started to suffer. So there were more interviews. Now there has really been a shutting out of Palestinian voices. Occasionally, when there is a sense of outrage at what has happened, when it cannot be ignored, it is always the human story, the emotional story that is given any kind of coverage, because it fits that wider agenda of only allowing Palestinians to speak as victims. But anytime we try to provide context or a political language or to talk about our aspirations on our own terms, using our frames of reference, the lexicon of liberation that we use and demand is used in contextualizing what's happened, either we are not given space, and that translates into pre-interview interviews where they try to talk to you about what are you going to say. And as soon as they realize that you are going to be speaking as more than a victim, then usually the interview doesn't proceed. Or you are flatly told we're not going to go down that line. Or you are that language of liberation, that language of contextualizing what's happened is actually laundered through a securitization framework, through a terrorism framework, through the idea that you are the one who's calling for the genocide of Israelis, the way that our language is manipulated to serve that agenda. So there are different ways in which our voices are managed, and the media is still, the mainstream media is still shutting us out, is still not giving us a space to talk on our own terms.
So there seems to be, you're suggesting that there is this, the media views, or your interactions with some of these media outlets, they view a kind of violence in some of the language that you are presenting or that you're trying to present. How does that kind of compare with the actual violence that is on the ground that you are there to talk about?
I mean, there is no comparison, but it's very much it very much suits that agenda of framing this in terms of Israel versus Hamas, in terms of Hamas versus Jews, in terms of the starting point being October 7. And what that does is creates this hypersensitivity to the suffering and viewpoints and agenda of Jewish Zionists and Israel, and a complete desensitization to Palestinian suffering, to actual genocide. And that comes out in so many ways. For example, the way in which we are asked to first condemn Hamas, the way in which we are constantly put in the defensive position of having to speak on behalf of, of having to answer to what happened on October 7th. And that's the framing device. And that, I think, that is our main obstacle in terms of the media framing. It is this whole idea of Israel versus Hamas. And that happens whether it's at, corporate legacy media, and it even filters down into, more diverse alternative platforms, which are still seduced by this idea that this is a war between Israel and Hamas. And what that does, I think, is it plays into the way that Israel, it's the relationship between its foreign policy levers and its actual military campaign. We see Israel eliminating or imprisoning Palestinian journalists. We see them, destroying the media, killing Palestinian journalists. And the way that then translates into mainstream Western media is that the Palestinian narrative, the Palestinian truth-telling, our attempts to document these crimes is buried under the rubble and the debris of smear campaigns of anti-Semitism, buried under the rubble of very aggressive and orchestrated lobby efforts to censor, to sack Palestinian journalists or pro-Palestinian journalists, to have a system in the media where those journalists who signed an open letter calling for fairer reporting are not allowed to report or write about Palestine and Israel. They're actually not allowed in newsrooms. There is, so many that I know who signed that letter, over 200 signed that letter, and they are shut out from reporting. Whereas those who have actually taken, trips to Israel, funded by Israeli lobby groups, are openly reporting and showing their bias and showing where they stand. So this idea of objectivity and neutrality is a farce. So this is some of the things that we are up against.
What do you think that's about, this idea that some voices are more credible than others when it comes to reporting on what is essentially a conflict?
It's an excellent question, because I think it speaks to the fundamental racism at the heart of this, and the fact that what we are up against is not just Israel versus Palestinians. It is it's an attempt to maintain the supremacy of a Western colonial order, which will always and has always represented the brown and black, colonized other as emotional, as unreasonable, as unrestrained, as bestial, as barbaric and uncivilized. And so it really does filter down, as you said, into who is considered a credible voice and who isn't. There are many Palestinians, such as myself, who are academics and experts. We speak as experts through our academic research, via our lived experience, and yet we are rarely respected in terms of that. We are seen as activists. I have no problem, absolutely no problem being seen as an activist. I wear it as a badge of honor. But it is something that is used to discredit your ability and credibility to speak in a mainstream media audience. And that's been said to me many times, and others have also reported back when they've been invited, we just want a civilized debate, Randa. We just want to keep the emotions down. Right. So it's constantly treating you as somebody who is emotional, is responding to what is happening, a settler, colonial, apartheid, genocidal regime and its crimes over 75 years. Your response is an emotional, unreasonable one, rather than one that is rooted in a Palestinian liberation freedom struggle.
And the implication that you are bringing something that is uncivilized to this discussion.
Exactly. And it plays into very much the language that has been used to justify this genocide. The children of light and the children of darkness. The idea that, the uncivilized Arabs and Palestinians need to be contained, and the civilized, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. There's a whole language that goes with this.
I want to read you a quote from one of your pieces that you wrote recently. And you say that sustained global media and political narratives and moral panics have long stigmatized and maligned Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern men as deviant, violent, criminal, hypersexualized, misogynistic, barbaric, and woman-hating. That is a terrifying list that paints a pretty grim portrayal of what people who are in position of victimhood can be perceived through the lens of some media outlets, through the lens of the West. Why does this image persist, in your opinion?
Well, of course, I'm not the first to say it. There are so many luminaries, such as starting, with, Edward Said, who every Palestinian will easily quote. The weight of Orientalism bears down on the way that media frames, interprets, represents and presents information. And of course, I was writing that in the context of the war atrocity and rape atrocity propaganda, particularly after the New York Times article, which was syndicated in mainstream in mainstream Australian newspapers. So it reverberated back into Australia. And what I saw and what prompted me to write the article was how there were people in, I would say, who used to be progressive except Palestine. Of course, we can debunk what that means if you're, but let's just call them PEPs, who seemed to suddenly after October 7 have their conscience awoken and started to, reach out and try to understand what was happening. And then the New York Times article came out and it's like they lost their minds, sharing it absolutely besides themselves, were unable to use any critical faculties to see this as a report that was so clearly in service of manufacturing consent for genocide. And I was, prompted to write it because I could see how our societies are so primed to immediately believe what was so clearly, obviously, a beat-up story and propaganda. But they were primed, even the most well-meaning people who usually use their critical thinking skills were unable to let go of that latent Orientalism, and were so. And not only that, they were unable to, and they were so quick to believe that, and there's been absolute, no attention to the actual documented cases of sexual violence against Palestinian girls and women that a UN report said that there was credible evidence of. There's been a media blockout of that. There's been no outrage by so-called white feminists. There's been a complete erasure of Palestinian, women and girls suffering at the hands of the Israeli army. And that goes into the fundamental racism and the racist landscape in which the media operates.
There was a time, I think, not too long ago, where there weren't too many strong, vocal Palestinian voices in the West that were able to articulate the situation the way that you are. And today there seems to be a generation of them. What pressures, what challenges are there for people such as yourself and others who are picking up this mantle and speaking on behalf of a lot of people, and also on behalf of people that are in Palestine and in Gaza specifically? The weight of that must be enormous, and the pressure of what you are up against must also be quite surmountable.
Because we're in a state of emergency, I haven't processed the pressure. I just deal with it every day. We all do. Because we're literally fighting a war on so many battlefronts. The way I would say the pressure manifests is to understand that the media landscape in which Palestinians are subjected to censorship and framed through the prism of terrorism or threat to Jewish communities or a rise in anti-Semitism. The juxtaposition of reporting on Palestinian protests and then there's been a rise in anti-Semitism. This constant, these subtle and explicit ways of demeaning our movement. All of this does reverberate in other areas of society, in other institutions, and mine is the academic institution. So I can give you an example of that relationship between the media and the academy, which wouldn't be apparent to most people unless you are a Palestinian in the academy. There are policies in place in the academy which are relevant to events that we put on, and we try to put on events on Palestine, and they are subject to particular scrutiny by the institution, not because in my case here there's any objection to the content or the framing of the event, but because of the policy around events which are likely to attract media and political public scrutiny and attention. So there is a hypersensitization and panic about what is this going to mean in terms of the scrutiny we're going to receive, the inevitable backlash of claims of anti-Semitism and hate speech. So the media creates that environment, which then trickles down into this chilling effect, into this paranoia. And that does feed back into how we manage our space in the academy. It feeds back into, it has repercussions on our right to academic freedom. So there is definitely this symbiosis between media censorship and the panic that it elicits in institutions around managing Palestinian voices and agency and activism.
And then what are the things, like in terms of strategy? You're somebody who is, you're an academic, but you're also a communicator. How do you strategize around what do I say? What do I prioritize? What do I make sure I'm trying to get across if I go into an interview situation?
I love that question because I've really been thinking a lot about it since October. I've never wanted to be an academic who just sits in my office and writes books that nobody reads, that's just going to fatten up my academic CV. I've always wanted to be accountable to my community and to feed back into my community and to be of my community. And so for me, it's very important that anything I write or say translates to different audiences. So there's always an academic audience, but I also like using social media because I feel social media is a platform, one of the most important, and we've seen how the ICJ literally used evidence from Twitter. So for all of those who look down on social media, particularly some people in the academy, they are completely erasing and undermining this incredibly powerful ability for the marginalized and the censored to use the space to have a voice. So I use social media a lot. I even opened up a TikTok account, but I'm still getting used to that.
You haven't made any TikToks yet?
I have, but they keep getting pulled down. So that's another thing of the way that we're shadow banned on social media. But I have enormous admiration and respect for that new generation on TikTok who are doing exceptional journalism, who are putting establishment media to shame, and who are showing us what it means to speak truth to power, to critique and debunk Israeli talking points and not be stenographers for Israel, and increasingly people are receiving their information from social media. I think, majority of people would. And this establishment legacy media is really going to make itself irrelevant.
I think one of the most impactful ways that Palestinian voices have communicated over the last couple of months is to frame the conversation not essentially about the immediacy of what's happening in Gaza, but about the wider conversation around the occupation, about the Nakba. The Nakba is a word now that has become mainstream,
Yes.
And I don't think it was 5 months ago. And to talk about Israeli apartheid and to kind of frame it in that way. Do you think that was kind of a conscious thing? Was it maybe lessons from the past that kind of framed the way that you and others have spoken when you were speaking in the media?
It wasn't so much like a conscious strategy. It was recognizing that our talking points and the way that we present in the media, there's a continuity. Where we didn't come out and start to say, what can we say that's new after October 7? It was trying to contextualize October 7 and also recognize that ignoring everything before erases, the critical understanding that this is a matrix of domination that is beyond just Gaza. There is the West Bank and occupation. There is the Nakba and 75 years of colonialism. There is the racism against Palestinians in Israel. So it was trying to constantly contextualize and bring back what is it that we are fighting for. And also crucially, I just remembered very crucially, what are we fighting for and what is the end game here? Because many, of those in the media would prefer if we just went back to 6th of October, and this has shown us that there is no way we are returning to the status quo. And this gives us an opportunity now to talk about, it's not just about ending the siege on Gaza. It's not just about ending the blockade or occupation. It is rolling back Zionism. It is eliminating Zionism, which is a racist political ideology. And that has given us the opportunity to start speaking about things that we have ad nauseum been talking about for decades.
I've got you on here to ask you about Hamas, about those atrocities. I have acknowledged Palestinian suffering, but I'm here to talk about what Hamas did to Israeli babies.
I have already addressed that, and I said if we are going to stop...
You're justifying it. How can you justify it?
I did not justify anything.
You said the reason Saturday occurred is because your people have been oppressed. If your people have been oppressed, if they are occupied, wage a war. If you feel justified in waging a war, fight Israeli soldiers with guns. Don't behead babies. You're laughing at it.
Because you do realise that there is a siege in Gaza where not even food is allowed in.
The Israeli government is sending out warnings to civilians. Yes, this is their retaliation.
Are you here to scream at me or interview me?
I'm not screaming at you at all, but I also can't let you spout things on here that I don't.
You're not letting me talk.
This is my show. Okay, talk.
Just this week, there was a referral of the Australian government to the ICC as an accessory to genocide in Gaza. And that was kind of put forward by a team of lawyers here. It is accusing not just the Prime Minister, but the Foreign Minister Penny Wong, Defense Minister Richard Marries, and the opposition leader Peter Dutton, providing, quote, explicit political, rhetorical, moral, military, and material support for alleged war crimes carried out by Israel. This seems like a pretty significant move forward. Do you know how this came about, and what does it mean now that it's made the headlines?
I mean, it's an excellent move, particularly as Anthony Albanese is the first leader of a Western country to be referred to the ICC under Article 15 of the Rome Statute. So that's historic, and his legacy, somebody who built a platform on being a voice for the oppressed and the marginalised, who made a lot of the fact that he comes from a very poor single mother home and was raised on Struggle Street, as he said. And now he and his government have that legacy to be proud of. It's historic in terms of actually drawing attention to the fact that Australia matters. And I can tell you this, not as an academic, but as an activist. Time and time again, the average person on the street will say, what does this have to do with us? Let them just fight it out. It's got nothing. It's the Middle East. It has everything to do with us. First of all, we're living on stolen land. So our settler colonial logics that infuse every foundation of this country is the reason why there is this staunch relationship between Australia and Israel. They literally share bonds over settler colonialism. And the fact that we are in partnership with Israel on so many levels, military partnerships, defense, diplomatic relations. And now here we have complicity in genocide. Because we're talking about the media, I wanted to draw attention to the fact that the way the media also can only hold two things in their head at once. And, on the same day that the case came out, and it was a case endorsed by 600 lawyers, some of the coverage was a bit problematic. For example, the ABC reporter interviewing one of the barristers who brought this King's Counsel seemed as though they were, taking on this very defensive position, as though they were, Albanese's defense lawyer, and this reticence to say genocide, not our word, not my word of choice. So that again shows these agendas. But also the same day, the Australian Centre of International Justice, in partnership with the Palestinian Centre for Human Rights in Gaza, had issued a call to the Australian government to cancel the visa of a former Israeli military senior figure who has been accused of serious war crimes in Gaza in 2001 to 2003. In fact, he evaded an arrest warrant in the UK. His visa was granted. He's actually in Australia now. He leaves tomorrow on a speaking tour for the United Israel Fund, Appeal Fund. There's been a complete media blackout of that story. A dossier of evidence was released to the media. The Australian government has been called on to call on the AFP to launch criminal investigation. And if it fails to do so, Australia will be in breach of its international legal obligations to investigate those accused of serious war crimes under the Geneva Convention. That has been totally ignored by the media. Not only ignored but suppressed. I know that on credible evidence, background evidence, that there is a fear of reporting this. And so it just goes again to the way that the media works in tandem with government agendas sometimes, very often, and how it's not working in the public interest to draw attention to something that is relevant to all Australians, not just Palestinians.
Yeah. South Africa's case against Israel at the ICJ really created a framework around how to talk about what's happening from a legal perspective, from an international law perspective. And whereas before that, it kind of felt like, things were kind of up in the air a little bit. It was really hard to give language to how to kind of hold the Israeli government to account. And this is yet another move from a legal perspective to try and kind of create that sort of sense of accountability. And I know that in the UK that there are efforts to try and do the same as well, and to kind of hold politicians accountable for even just the rhetoric that they're saying in public, whether it's defense of actions of the State of Israel, or propagating unconfirmed reports. In the UK in particular, there was a story of the beheaded babies, which there was one day where it was the front page of almost every newspaper, and it was repeated by a number of prominent political figures. And so now there's an attempt to try and say, okay, well, we're collecting all of this information and we're going to hold you to account for it. What impact do you think this has, not only in terms of like the political ramifications for these people as individuals, but also for reframing the narrative around international law, international diplomacy, and how a country like Australia, for example, can position itself in relation to what's happening in Gaza?
I think Noura Erakat has just, paved the way for really understanding how we can use international law as a strategy and as a tool, because we know it is it forms part of a colonial system, Western order. We know all that. It's not there for us. But that does not stop us at particular times from using it to our advantage. And understanding the game here is long term. Anybody who's been an activist or part of the Palestinian movement knows that we're not going to achieve liberation in a few months. It is constantly pushing back. It's a movement. So the moves sometimes are fast and sometimes they're very slow and incremental. But everything counts. Everything counts. And so shift. You're pushing back. And what we're seeing now is this appetite for using the language of international law and chipping away at the impunity which Israel has enjoyed for so long. And this is the shock to the system that we need to deliver with these kinds of actions. The shock to the system that a prime minister will be held accountable for repeating propaganda about 40 babies and for providing moral legitimacy to a genocide, so that they will start to understand that that rhetoric does have consequences. And that matters. That is a huge win for us, because we have operated in a landscape where literally nothing you say or do in support of Israel seems to have any consequence, material consequence. So even if the case doesn't go anywhere, it still provides a language and it lifts the mask on Israel's impunity.
We have received an unimaginable amount of really truly horrific imagery. And that a lot of that imagery has kind of shown Palestinians of all ages in Gaza and in the West Bank and elsewhere in the worst light humanly possible. And there's an aspect of it which feels, morbidly familiar, right? This is the way that we always see people in Palestine and Gaza specifically. But there's another aspect of it where it feels like it is far beyond anything that we've seen in our lifetimes and maybe even, to some extent since 1948. What do you think that all adds up to? This overwhelming amount of misery and horror that we consume, on our phones, on TV. What does that do to us, to our ability to perceive what is going on, to our ability to connect with what's going on?
The horror that we've witnessed on our phones. And I say on our phones because it's so intimate. And where do we consume and look at our phones? On public transport, in bed, when we're lying down, when we wake up, when we go to sleep, on our couches at home. It's such an intimate, conveyor of these images. And that matters. If you're seeing the dismembered body of a child dangling from a wall in your bedroom when your children are around you, that matters to your psyche. And I feel that there's a few effects of that. It's either going to galvanize people, this kind of horror after horror after horror. And it has. We have seen, unprecedented waves globally of solidarity with Palestine. And I feel that the blood of Palestinians now is sort of the ink that's connecting the dots between solidarity struggles, really. On the other hand, there's the desensitization effect, which is worrying, because we have always struggled against the notion that our killing, our suffering is inevitable, is acceptable, is banal and routine, and something that our agency here in Western societies is not going to change. It's just the barbaric, uncivilised Middle East doing what it does. And the more people are desensitized by seeing us as victims, there will be an effect among some of the population who see this as so insurmountable, so horrific, that it just becomes something that they don't need, that they don't have any impact in changing. Or for those in the population who see this and are desensitized, then the images can get as barbaric as you can get, and it has no effect. I'm glad. I always say, Alhamdulillah, thank God I'm surrounded by people who are impacted, who are not able to function. It shows that we're human. The others are walking dead. To be able to see this and continue on with your day, that's horrific. The other thing is when we're talking about the media here, and it's always certain stories out of those horrors, if they are drawn attention to, that usually get platformed. The women, the children, the babies. rarely is it the men. And that feeds into what we were talking about before. This dehumanization has multiple layers, and at the apex of that dehumanization is the Palestinian man, whose suffering and, whose torture and killing is not considered worthy of sympathy, worthy of advocacy. And that's very clear. Yesterday, my friend messaged me an image from the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald, and she said, "Oh my God, I cannot believe they published this finally." And it was the image of a Palestinian woman who had been for years trying to fall pregnant and had gone through, IVF and had baby twins, and they were slaughtered. And I thought to myself, it really takes like the level of inconceivable suffering to get on the front pages. But who are we to judge whose life is worthy of the front pages? Surely all of them are worthy, and they should be every single day. But it goes again about how the racist media landscape determines who is worthy of platforming and who isn't.
I think one of the images that that sticks out of my mind, and it's unfortunate that this is the image, but it was just the how surreal it was, is the image of Palestinian men and young boys being detained, blindfolded,
Yes.
and stripped, and either in their homes, the living rooms of their homes, or made to walk in through the streets. And that image, when it first came out, when it was first made public, and the reason that it was made public was because it was shared by IDF soldiers.
Yes.
There was something kind of almost confusing about why would you share this? This is not making you look very good. And then upon reflection, when I'm thinking about it now, it seems that there is an intentionality to presenting specifically Palestinian men in that way. What message do you think these images send? And do you think they are received the same way that if this was happening to Palestinian women and being shared in the same way?
I mean, the strategy in sharing them by the IDF is the humiliation, because, it's the idea of stripping down the dignity of Palestinian men, and also stripping down their status as fighters and freedom fighters and those resisting to naked men, infantilized and stripped of all kind of agency and power. So it serves that purpose. They were horrific, and I felt them very viscerally, having, an elderly father, and we all see our own family in those images, and we know that that would have been so painful to endure and to experience. So there is definitely that strategy there. I don't know if we do know actually that similar images have been released about the women who were taken after in the ground offensive after October 7. I think there were 40 women. Don't quote me on that. I was just reading this morning in terms of that report about the sexual abuse of Palestinian girls and women, saying that the women and girls were, stripped, deprived of their hijabs, transported in like animal caged trucks. So again, it's this strategy of humiliation, but it's always particularized in a gendered way, and we see this as, race critical feminists, that there's particular ways that violence is carried out. And of course, stripping the girls in particular and the women, but also when it has been mixed, stripping them in front of the opposite gender. So there's all these strategies. And the thing is, as those of us who have been in this before October 7, this isn't new. This is documented for decades. It's a very deliberate tactic of torture in imprisonment conditions, because not just rape, but the threat of rape or humiliating in front of other prisoners. It's all part of that landscape of violence.
And, you mentioned this earlier in our conversation, but this language of sexual violence, the language of rape, has really dominated the way that that October 7th was spoken about. And, there are kind of, according to the UN experts, there are credible cases that need to be investigated. But the language of it, the imagery around it, has really provided a very clear language for how Palestinian men in particular are talked about, and the way that Hamas is talked about in the media. And it's kind of been a lot of it. There's some reports that kind of have been challenged, and the New York Times one, for example. But by and large, this narrative has been accepted from the very beginning as something that is either it's true or it's likely to be true.
Yeah.
Whereas these stories coming out now, again, backed by UN experts, of these Palestinian women and these young girls and what's happening to them in detention. You mentioned those reports, and there's stories about women being strip searched at every stage of that detention. About hearing or seeing stories of other women that were raped or that were sexually tortured, and this idea that these stories are also coming out. There are also Palestinian voices that are saying this is happening to us. Do you think that they're being taken as seriously as the stories that came out on October 7th?
Absolutely not. I mean, again, in mainstream media, the political landscape, of course not. And that's because Israel's propaganda is always treated as credible and, accepted, and no criticality applied. But when it comes to Palestinians, even our death tolls are considered with suspicion and questioned routinely. It's not even a shocking thing to say, but they are always questioned as incredulous. Everything, our testimony is always considered suspect, and it's an inversion again of oppressor and oppressed, and a projection. Everything that Israel accuses us of, it does 1,000 times worse. But the media is not doing the job of calling to account. And even with the New York Times rape story, let's say that there is a retraction. We live to see it. Is there going to just be a retraction, or is there also going to be some criticality in asking what was the purpose of that propaganda? Can we not see some, journalists pushing and saying in mainstream media, because there's of course a lot doing it independently, what purpose did it serve? What was the agenda behind that? And that's what we're missing in the media landscape. Not just being stenographers for Israel, but actually applying critical skills to what's happening.
What do you think it would take for this narrative to change, to shift? There's an aspect of this where in the days and weeks after October 7th, it almost felt like we were in a time machine and we're gone back to September 11, because the language felt very similar. It felt very deeply familiar. And on some level, there's a kind of Islamophobia and orientalism that feels like it's so deeply ingrained in how these people, our people, are spoken about, that hasn't changed, despite how many people are now speaking, despite how many successful voices there are representing these communities, despite the familiarity that Western societies have now had with their own Arab and Muslim communities, with their own connection to the Middle East. That doesn't feel like it has changed, or at least in some pockets of the media, it hasn't changed. What do you think it would take for that change to happen?
I think, first of all, we need to adjust our expectations. So if I'm sitting here expecting Murdoch media to change and shift position, I'm going to be waiting forever. So it's also understanding where our ability to shift power resides and working there. And ultimately, institutions get away with a lot because they represent themselves as institutions without individuals making up those institutions. So there is responsibility on individuals within. What will it take? It will take so-called progressives within those institutions, those with privilege, job security, platforms, and the ability to speak back, to take a stand, to resign, to stand up and make statements publicly and boldly in support of Arab and Palestinian journalists who are either sacked or doxxed or suffer, material harm from speaking out on Palestine. So others need to take those stands. We are sick to death and tired of solidarity whispered behind closed doors in, private conversations. There's no longer a time for that's not solidarity, actually. It's performative. It needs to be done in a way that has a material effect on changing institutional power. That's one thing that we need to see. And I think there have been many calls for that. Walk out of the New York Times. You have to actually make sacrifices if you want to be part of a movement, if you profess to hold progressive values and social justice.
Because the sacrifices are being made by Arab voices. They're being made by people such as yourself every time you speak.
My sacrifices are nothing. The fact is journalists are being eliminated, assassinated in Gaza. If you're a journalist in any Western society, that should matter to you. If you profess to be part of a profession, then those people who are your colleagues, your peers, are being mass slaughtered. Then if you're not going to take a stand now, then what is your journalism worth? You're worth nothing. You're really worth nothing. And that's one point. In terms of shifting, I think also believing in the power of granular interactions, make a difference in mobilizing movements, and never underestimate the power of conversations. It sounds so Pollyanna-ish, but that's how movements grow. And we've seen this massive shift since October 7. And it hasn't been a shift in the power or the establishment. It's been a shift on the streets. And that's where you get the groundswell that creates the pressure on governments to act, because ultimately they're accountable to us. So I feel that there's a real underestimation of the shift since 9/11 of young people. And I that was my last academic project. I actually interviewed and did writing workshops with young people born around 9/11. So they've only ever known a world at war on terror.
Yeah.
They've only grown up in that. And there is a tremendous amount of, sympathy and empathy and critical thinking among that generation who aren't so readily willing to buy into the propaganda. And I think that's where the shift happens, because they'll eventually be the ones in the newsrooms. They'll be the ones making those decisions. And we have to give them the capacity to exercise their political agency, get out on the streets, and hopefully by the time they enter positions of power, then they will have the moral fortitude to be able to do the right thing.
And finally, Randa, talking about that generation, those young people that have been incredibly vocal on the streets, on social media, on TikTok, as you mentioned, what kind of narrative can they create that allows us to speak about people in positions like the ones that there are in Gaza today, and in other places as well, but to start changing the way that we talk about people from this part of the world, but also people that aren't natural victims in the eyes of Western narratives. What kind of narrative can we replace that with that, in your eyes, can be a lot more constructive and can help us have conversations that aren't, so-called civilized or uncivilized?
Yeah, well, I think what's happening now is people are understanding that what we are talking about, the language that we share as in our transnational struggles, is a language of justice, of anti-racism, of anti-colonialism, and that these are all intersectional, that these are all connected. And we see that in the way that now we are talking about this struggle, and that language now isn't just for the so-called fringe radical movements, it has become mainstreamed. That's huge, because what it does is it lifts the veil off of Zionism. It lifts the rhetorical shields that Zionism has used to hide its very white supremacist, Jewish supremacist, racist ideological foundations. That is how we shift the power, by understanding that what we are fighting against, including with anti-Zionist Jews, is anti-race. We're fighting against racism and colonialism and settler colonialism. And I think this is where the hope lies, because when we frame the terms of reference, when we demand that the way that we're going to speak, the language and grammar that we use for our liberation movement is going to be on our terms, then we're going to see a shift in understanding this situation, understanding, diagnosing the problem.
Randa Abdel Fattah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Big Picture, and a big thank you to Dr. Randa Abdel Fattah for being our guest today. You can check out her book, Coming of Age in the War on Terror, where she explores a lot of the themes that she touched on in this conversation. Please let us know what you think in the comments below, and make sure to like and subscribe if you want to hear more. As always, you can find all of our episodes in audio format wherever you get your podcasts from. And until next time, salam.